Hello classmates, my name is Andy Hamilton and this is my second oral presentation for class number EIU 4158. My topic today is the Palmer raids. The idea is to show how, for a brief time in the years 1919 and 1920, the acting Attorney General of the United States effectively suspended the First Amendment and took away rights that people living here should have had. This is highly relevant to our course because when you're studying the evolution of freedom of expression and freedom of speech and how we got to where we are today, instances like the Palmer raids truly changed the way people thought about these and brought issues to the forefront that may have not been brought up before. Before we get too in-depth, though, with what happened in 1919 and 1920, we just need to understand the world that people were living in at the time. Europe, across the ocean, was still recovering from World War I. Their economy was in shambles still, alliances were gone, and it was just a very confusing time. In Russia, one of the most significant events of the 20th century had just taken place, which was the Communist Revolution in a preceding November. On the other side, back home, the United States was not booming like it would later after World War II. World War I didn't really do that for the USA. We had economic problems. 1 in 5 workers were on strike in the United States at the time. Also, the unemployment rate was as high as 10 to 15%. So we're talking between those two, 33% of American working age males were out of work or refusing to go because of strike. This was also a time where racial tensions were still high, which led to all types of political controversies. There was a famous race riot in Chicago in 1919. The anarchist movement was also growing in the United States as well as in Europe, and really worldwide. This anarchist movement was unique compared to other political movements as they did have the tendency to get violent. In April of 1919, 36 different bombs were mailed all over the United States in coordination to try to kill prominent Americans, whether they be wealthy, politicians, things to that nature. Also in 1919, the Communist Party was founded in the United States. Now, there were already communists here, but the official Communist Party of America was founded that year. That is significant because the Red Scares would shape the next 50 years of American history. And while the Palmer raids weren't only directed towards communists, this was the first of many Red Scares. You know, things like McCarthy, which would happen 30, 40 years later, would follow suit. This landscape of political and economic instability made it very difficult to govern. Officials like Mitchell Palmer, the Attorney General, would stop at nothing to secure the peace. Palmer, who you can see here, was a congressman in Pennsylvania, part of the Democratic Party from 1909 to 1915. When he was in the House of Representatives, and when he made connections to future presidents, most importantly to Woodrow Wilson, who would later appoint him as Attorney General. However, before that, Palmer proved his worth to Wilson. In 1917, he was appointed a title called Alien Property Custodian, and his job was essentially to investigate illegal aliens or legal aliens, and then he could seize property of anyone that he deemed illegal or dangerous. It was said that his assets grew into the tens of millions. He seized so much, and he, even at this early time, was probably trampling on First Amendment rights, but it was a time of uncertainty and a time of war, and it was okay to do. His zeal and effectiveness at his job as alien property custodian caught the eye of Wilson, and when the time came to appoint a new Attorney General in 1919, he looked no further than Palmer. Shortly after, Palmer became Attorney General in June of 1919, June 3rd to be exact. Suicide bombers, or sometimes just delivered bombs, in 8 cities went off in the country. These were much larger than any other terrorist attack the United States had seen up to this point. These bombs had up to 25 pounds of dynamite. If this happened today, a war would start. In Washington, D.C. specifically, our friend Palmer was actually targeted. His house was destroyed by one of these bombs. Now, his family and himself, obviously, were left unharmed. However, this, of course, left a very lasting impact on him. Other targets were judges, politicians, and others who had supported the Sedition Act of 1918, which increased the federal power to be able to deport, detain, and seize illegal aliens with very little legal ramifications. Because of the coordination of these attacks and the people who were targeted, like Palmer, it was very clear that foreigners, whether they be anarchists, communists, but foreign nationals were the ones behind this. In the wake of these terrorist attacks, you have a newly appointed Attorney General who already had a history of cruelty against illegal aliens on his resume. It wasn't much of a surprise that he would react to the terror of 1919 in a very big way. Less than a week after the bombings happened, he had a plan for mass deportation. He wanted to get rid of tens of thousands of people. However, this was still America, and he didn't have the power just to do that on a whim. So he did actually have to prove the legality of his plan to immigration lawyers and the Department of Labor. He actually accomplished this by saying that he would only go after aliens who he could prove were threatening or had ties to a dangerous organization. So, about 5 months after the terrorist attack destroyed his house, the Palmer raids began. It was actually on the anniversary of the Russian Revolution, so in November of 1919, the Palmer raids officially started. For the next 4 months, he started rounding up aliens who he deemed threatening. Many of these things were in violation of the First Amendment. He was deporting as many as 250 people a week through Ellis Island. We should note the irony here because Ellis Island was once the welcoming arms of the Statue of Liberty. Now it seemed like she was saying, get out. Palmer did justify his actions. He believed in it. His exact quote was, "The revolution is eating its way into the home of the American workers, licking at the altars of our churches, crawling into sacred corners of American society, burning up America's foundation." And Palmer was not alone in these thoughts. And in the beginning, his raids were actually well received by the American people. They ignored the First Amendment violations because they thought he was just an American doing his job, going after dangerous people. So at the beginning, his raids were supported. However, the raids continued into 1920. More and more people were being detained on questionable measures, and the political and public support was dwindling. They recognized the First Amendment violations. By this time, he had deported 5,000 people, most of them to places like Finland, and people and politicians alike were realizing that something just wasn't right here. This sentiment was crystallized when a new Secretary of Labor was appointed. His name was Louis Post, and he saw right away what was going on, and he led a federal investigation. Of the 5,000 deportations, according to historian Harold Evans, he concluded that only 556 were legit arrests. That means less than 10% of the people that Palmer uprooted out of their homes, took their property, took their assets, and sent to another country broke, were actually illegal. Disgusted by this, Louis Post, the Secretary of Labor, moved for Palmer's impeachment in late 1920. However, Palmer, through quality legal teams and a little bit of political savviness, managed to avoid impeachment. Really, it's because, however, it is significant to note that his raids stopped. He no longer conducted the raids once people got wise to this. He may have still been impeached, but by 1921, a new president was replacing Wilson, Warren G. Harding, and as we all know, when a new president comes in, cabinet positions like the Attorney General typically go goodbye. And that's what happened to Palmer. Freedom of speech and expression has evolved over the years. the one consistent thing that you can say is that it's typically a gradual thing. Rights aren't gained overnight, and they're typically not lost overnight. However, in times of peril, whether it be war, terrorist attacks, whatever it may be, these freedoms can suffer huge setbacks in brief periods of time. Attorney General Palmer acted with absolute power over the First Amendment for 4 months in 1919 and 1920. So while it may seem that freedom of speech and expression is secure and evolved where we are today, all it takes is something like this to experience another Palmer raids and set these freedoms back 100 or 2 years. By investigating and learning about why this man conducted his raids in the way he did, you can get a clearer understanding of the evolution of freedom of expression and speech. I would like to thank you all for your time. I hope you enjoyed the presentation, and I look forward to seeing yours. Happy 4th of July!